All right, it is only the first week in September, but I am delighted that we have our second distinguished speaker of this coming year, Denae Ford Robinson, visiting us from Microsoft Research. Denae Ford Robinson is principal researcher at Microsoft Research in the Saints Group, and also an affiliate assistant professor in the Human-Centered Design and Engineering Department at the University of Washington. She received her BS, MS, and PhD from North Carolina State University in computer science with a graduate minor in cognitive science at the PhD level. She does work at the intersection of human-computer interaction and software engineering. As we know, there are a lot of barriers to people participating in various kinds of socio-technical communities in and surrounding computer science. And so Denae's work is aimed at identifying and dismantling those cognitive and social barriers. And to do that, she designs mechanisms that support software developer participation in those systems. She's done research that she's well known for in just-in-time mentorship as a way of empowering welcoming engagement and collaborative Q&A for online programming communities, including open source software, and also work to empower marginalized identity groups of software developers in online communities. Her most recent research investigates how to meaningfully engage software developers and how they apply AI to their software development process, and identify techniques to understand trust in AI-powered software tools and their adoption, which I think is related to your talk here today. Her research has been recognized and awarded grants from the National GEM Consortium Fellowship, the National Science Foundation, and Microsoft Research. We're very delighted to have Dr. Denae Ford Robinson with us today, and look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. I didn't know you guys were gonna clap. That's cute. I'm going to start my timer because I sometimes have a way of being long-winded, and I want to make sure I don't take over too much time than I anticipated. Thank you all for coming. Again, I'm Denae. I'm a researcher at MSR. It feels great to kind of be back in Pittsburgh, visiting a bunch of old colleagues, seeing familiar faces. So I'm really excited to be here today. I'm going to mostly be talking a lot about research that we kind of did around the early adoption of some of these AI tools, so like GitHub Copilot. A lot of those lessons that we learned really does influence how we see these tools kind of evolving moving forward, and how communities can be a big part of that. So I'm really going to be talking a lot about how developers tools or developer communities can be these great disruptors if we let them, if we empower, if we enable that. People are using it in different ways to do that for themselves, but I think there's ways we can be building systems to better support that. So this talk is going to have a lot of open questions and hopefully inspire a lot of new research opportunities or a lot of interns to come work with me on so this is definitely a recruitment talk as well. So my plan for today, again, going over some of those early insights from some of those studies, thinking about GitHub Copilot, other tools as well. And I want to really dive deep into what communities can enable, and thinking a lot about some speculative design work that we were kind of executing that can hopefully encourage others to kind of expand and do some speculative work about what it would mean for other communities, even beyond developers. In fact, most of the talk, I'll probably be referencing a lot of developer communities specifically, but if you're familiar with some of my work before, I also reference a lot of external communities and how those can be adopted. Some of those affordances and tooling and approaches can make sense for developers. So that's kind of the goal for some of the speculative features on the AI work today. So I have always been a person who's thrives on communities, and I think it's really interesting because communities have always been a great way of getting a pulse on things. They're where we go when we don't know, when we need help, when we don't know what we need help on, we don't know the right questions to ask. It's where we go when we want to kind of sometimes offer perspective, offer advice to someone if we have downtime. They've also always been at the nexus of some new information, or nexus of when we don't know the information we need to know and how we get that information. And it's been helpful to do that globally too. In a similar vein, they have also been helpful for the insight for developers as well. Actually, I should click. That doesn't work. Let's do this one. Okay. Yeah, so it's also been really helpful for developers as well. So when we think of something, when we learn about a new technology, the first thing you do, or anything new, you talk to a friend about it. You ask a friend, or you ask them, have you heard about this thing? Communities, online forums enable that. And the same for developers too. Developers are humans. Most of the talk, again, I'm going to be talking about developers. I'm going to be humanizing them. So there's maybe times in here I refer to them as programmers for a purpose or devs plus, because everyone doesn't consider themselves hardcore programmers now, especially within the uprise of these tools. But ultimately, the way we work has been changing. When I say we as researchers, I know there's been some work that some folks who are here, like Jen and Yang, has worked with us on how we can even use some of these AI tools to support our research trajectories, research problems, research questions. And the same has been the case for developers. So in, I think, mid-2021 is when GitHub Copilot kind of was on the scene. And since that time, we've been really diving deeper into how generative AI can really help support developer productivity. But I like to think of beyond that. I'm a little bit more of just productivity. I'm thinking more about kind of engagement. What enables our productivity? What are the tools and resources we use to do that? And one of the early projects that we were investigating was how developers are using this new tool that got released in the Wild Wild West and how they're making sense of it at scale. And so no surprise, they're doing that in communities too, right? So we were kind of in this study when we kind of connected this in late 2021. We wanted to get a better idea of how developers were using GitHub Copilot. What were the use cases besides the high and sexy stories you see on, on Twitter and in the news? So we were looking at a lot about what are the effective use cases, what are the meaningful ones, the productive ones, but also where are there moments of play? Where are people tinkering with things just to see how things work? So we kind of conducted these multi-stage analysis, but the ones I really want to call out were this forum discussion, because again, when people don't know what to do or when they want to share what's happening, they resort to online communities to do that. Especially if they're distributed, they don't have the resource of all their developer friends in the same room as them, especially with new tools. But every organization didn't have access to GitHub Copilot in November of 2021. One of the key findings I do want to call out, didn't show up there. Once we identify some of the analysis from the 279 forum posts, the 2,000 survey responses, I won't dive too deep into this because this at this point is a little bit older, although the paper is only for 2023. We did the work way in advance. I want to call out the fact that there was interesting findings around developers were coding less, but reviewing more. And they were also maybe spending less time on Stack Overflow, popular developer forum, but spending more time kind of understanding what this code means, or they needed to spend more time understanding what the code means, but they had less of opportunity to do so because there were affordances in the tool that didn't give them that. And I'll talk a little bit about more how we can design affordances and tools that kind of enable or empower us to do that. What I want to definitely provoke throughout this talk is that communities can be helpful for enabling trust, as in learning how to use something. People are learning how folks are using GitHub Copilot, the cool creative ways they can support their software development tasks. But they're also learning how to be skeptical, and reasonably so, right? So we're thinking about appropriate trust, when they should be leaning more into these tools for certain tasks versus others. And that's what communities are really helpful to do. Beyond GitHub Copilot, there's communities have been a way to do that as well, beyond developers. And one example of that is when we think about how the broader group of citizens have been using AI tools before. And I draw a lot on this matched model of trust from Vera Lau, who is also at Microsoft Research, but she's been really thinking about trust in these tools as black boxes for just broader citizens. When I say broader citizens, I just mean people who are not developers. And the attributes that the parts of this trust model, this match model, there's like threefold. So the first one is these trustworthy attributes, as in what are the characteristics about a system or about a model that encourage us to trust it? What are those affordances? What are those cues that enable us to understand how an interface works, how we should engage with the interface? And then from those actual affordances and those trustworthy cues, they help us inform our judgment. They help us make a call on how to use the system. They help us generate our own heuristics of how to use these. which then inform us to take an action, to trust the system or to not, to engage with it or not. And these are all within the AI system, right? So this is how Vera puts it that we should be using AI systems, how broader citizens use AI systems. And what I was positing is, well, why wouldn't communities be a part of that? Online communities help us, or communities in general, help us make decisions. Again, we refer to our friends, we refer to our colleagues when we're making these decisions. And online communities and these socio-technical ecosystems that exist offline and online are really helpful at that. So through that understanding, we were building out how to, or asking questions more around how situated trust or the context of trust, what are the different affordances and cues that you can provide in the system that can enable that? Of course, the popular question I get often is, why online communities? Why does it matter? And for the same reasons I mentioned earlier, they're able to kind of be these hosts of information. These platforms are able to kind of encourage information seeking. They have different ways for you to search and find that information. You're able to find similar questions. You can verify sources. Reputation signals these are all mechanisms that are embedded into how online communities work that are actually pretty essential when you think about if there's a new novel technology that came out on the scene. I would want to be able to verify what I'm looking at. I would want to know how it helps or works for other people. I would want to know their context for using it, and how does that adapt to mine? So with that, we were kind of asking research questions. I'll hit with two research questions actually, which is one, how do we use online communities to shape developers' trust in AI tools? And then also, how can we design tools to better facilitate trust? So thinking about affordances and online communities that are critical, but we're not really as explicit about them, because if we were explicit, it would have already existed. So we did this twofold approach. Actually, there's a threefold approach. There was also a form analysis of how developers were engaging with Copilot in November 2021, but it wasn't that many people, so we didn't share that part of the paper. So we started, after we did that analysis, we identified that we needed to take an approach that makes sense for this kind of nexus type of technology. So for part one, we conducted these semi-structured interviews with developer community participants and asked them about a range of tools they use, expectations of using AI tools, use cases that were helpful for them, risky situations they may be concerned about. I think it's also important that we highlight that we were focusing on developers, yes, because GitHub Copilot existed, but there was already ChatGPT available. Developers, being builders of these tools, have a unique perspective, right? Because they are builders, they will be the ones that are adapting these tools or adopting these tools inside organizations. So they know what goes wrong. So we wanted to make sure we capture their perspective as the ones who could be building and adopting these as well. And then part two is that we kind of built these design probes in this mock-up to get a better idea of what would be helpful, give some thought-provoking ideas for them to point to and say, this is helpful and this is not. One of the core findings, and I'll kind of hopefully go quickly through these things. In thinking about the original MASH model about how online communities and socio-technical ecosystems can better be supported, we were figuring out, well, what is it about communities that make it helpful? The evaluation signals. So being able to review and see what others have said about content is really helpful. And it helps us develop our own heuristics. It helps us refine that. So for one of our findings from our studies was that, really understanding that the transparency of the source, as in how they use this tool, were they able to kind of say what worked, what doesn't work? Have they been able to connect their findings to another person's findings? So I use GitHub Copilot for kind of specking out like my comments. What type of use cases work best for this? Who are the other developers who are in a similar have a similar experience as me? Are they also using it in a similar way, or are expert developers using it in a different way? Essentially, participants were really highlighting that it's really helpful to have a solution. It gives you a little bit more faith when you see that others have used it. You're able to have mechanisms like voting and discussion to kind of give these thought-provoking exercise and figure out what makes sense for the solution. Secondly, we also found out that these community curated experiences were really helpful. So again, being able to find these specific experiences that were relevant to how you would develop. So understanding the strategies of when others have trusted these systems as well. So I'll call out this quote from another participant here. Being able to, I read a bunch of what people think of the outcome would be, but it helps me make my own perception of whether or not something is useful for me or not. So not accepting something as is, but helping you develop and refine your understanding. And it gives you kind of that guidance of what to avoid and what not to. Okay, so that's kind of the community curated experience, to summarize it. But while these interactions are really helpful for understanding AI, I want to also drive home the point that there are affordances that make it helpful. The ability to kind of read multiple responses have been helpful. See how other people have used these tools. And these together help the collective sense-making aspect of communities that's helpful. That currently does not exist, not at scale. And the study was conducted in 2021. It does not exist at scale still. So there's several challenges effectively using it in online communities. It's really thinking about how we can maybe even get a better description of the information, the context, how we can replicate experiences, which we know is really hard for a lot of use cases when we're trying to replicate how Copilot works or GitHub Copilot works. I'll skip through some of these a little bit. What I want to really get us to think more about too is that now that we understand how these two different pathways, the the collective sense making, the community evaluation signals, which are helpful, how can we better leverage these to design new interfaces, new ways to shape trust? And one way of doing that is we kind of created these design probes to kind of get the wheels turning for some of these developers. So I don't have a clicker, but I can point. Actually, I'll do one more clicker here. So here you can see that we are thinking about what are those attributes that were really helpful. Community voting, being able to see others who have found value in some of these suggestions from Copilots. Those who have been able to share and find and use it elsewhere. Well, further, the community user statistics, being able to see how many people have accepted something without edits, being able to see the percentage of edits that are relevant for people in your similar level or role of work. So if I'm a junior software developer, it would be helpful to see how many suggestions were accepted without edits, or being able to see how many code snippets were similar to this that I just didn't get presented, that are based on the same task I'm working on. Or even better, how many were rejected? How many of those were actually maybe more aligned with my task that I just didn't have insight into at all? And these are the types of transparency information that is currently missing. But those are the signals that we're using implicitly when we use online communities. Like we go to Stack Overflow, we'll see an accepted answer. We check to see if the score is high. If the person has a high ranking status in the community, then I'm more likely to trust their response. Those are types of identity representation signals. I showed earlier the community usage signals. Those types of stats about how tools are used they drive how communities work. They help us refine and make our own decisions in these communities. And that's essentially what this work is about. And I left the URL there as well. And I just think it's really interesting because we were exploring some of these in 2021 or 2022 actually, and there hasn't been a lot of work to understand what it would look like in a imaginative fictional world. So this is you all familiar with the IDE here. I talked a little bit about being able to share and highlight experiences. What if there was like a TikTok for developers, right? Where you're able to, so technically GitHub Copilot is recording some of your interactions, right? In the context of your ID, of course, yes. Not sharing with everyone. But maybe, so you're working on a piece of code and maybe you're like, oh, you know what? There's a novice that I've talked to, like there's a new intern who just joined who would actually really benefit from seeing how I walk through this. What if you could immediately record that and share that with them? So think about some of the challenges in online communities now is being able to, people have a hard time sharing their experiences. How do we reduce that barrier? How do we enable others to do that? And make it easy to share, make it easy to contribute. How can we use generative AI to help us do that? This is one example of doing that. Or even as we're actually working, with Copilot, we can tell others, share videos, send our repo to them, and allow others to kind of comment and engage on that. And that's the type of value that we see in communities. When you go to Stack Overflow, you go to Reddit, you go to several other forums, you're kind of see what others have tried and what works for them. You're evaluating the context. This gives you that context. It'll be interesting to see some of these things at scale. Overall, some of our participants were really excited about it. Big challenges they called out were like the privacy and confidentiality, of course, of if I'm at a software organization, I don't want all of this code to be maybe everything doesn't, there needs to be a scope box of who can access to see my videos. So like a team specific, a Stack Overflow team specific or enterprise specific version of that. But overall, there was a lot of excitement over the scaffolding of the work and integration into the workflow. Again, making it easier to share, easier to be a part of community, easier to access. And then as I transition a little bit, I highlighted some of these things, but there may be additional ways that we can like leverage some of these tools for communities. And I say Devs++ or Dev++ communities, because again, I mentioned earlier, these programmers for a purpose, or people who may not consider themselves developers, or honestly, just people tinkering with Copilot tools. And there are some initial kind of approaches out there that are making waves and actually really, really helpful. One of them is Prompt Buddy. Is anyone familiar with this tool? Okay, so Prompt Buddy is a tool that some Microsoft developers, I don't think they would claim it as a full Microsoft product, but Prompt Buddy is helpful to kind of understand how others have shared their prompts, how others have tinkered and iterated over their prompts for a specific task. The cool thing about Prompt Buddy is that it is bespoke to whatever community that you want it to be on. It's not something that lives publicly on the internet. It may live within your organization or your team. So essentially, if you want to use it for a classroom, like I know before using Stack Overflow Teams or Enterprise for a specific class environment, you could use Prompt Buddy for that too. And it's open source and publicly available, so I encourage you all to check it out. But here you can have the history of the top contributors. You can see the frequented prompts that people have used and their votes. Again, being able to have that voice of being able to sift through what's valuable and what's not valuable. And maybe you can make it bespoke for whatever context makes sense for you. So there's not a GitHub Copilot version on here, but for the Microsoft suite, which makes it very Microsoft on brand, there's ways to see how people have been able to make it work for them in an effective way. So there's a lot of community metrics, and this came out much later. There's a lot of different community heuristics and collective sense making that people are finding value for, again, prompt engineering for a specific work task, but maybe there's opportunities to kind of also expand that beyond the traditional workflow. Another one is ShareGPT. Have people heard of this one? Okay. So ShareGPT is pretty cool. I think I found about it in 2022, I think. But ShareGPT is pretty awesome because you can actually share your ChatGPT prompts and you can share them with a URL. You'll be able to generate a URL to your ChatGPT prompt, and you can see people commenting on it, sharing experiences. I think I have a picture of it. Yeah. You can share your prompts, see how others have kind of like commented on it, saved it, viewed it, being able to kind of amplify the work you're doing so that everyone's not working in silos. That's kind of one of the great powers of communities, being able to not, even though you may be distributed or may be remote, ability to kind of share that knowledge, get feedback on it, iterate, allow others to also iterate on it and give you feedback. And this kind of cyclic, I can't say that word right now, but this collective way of kind of working through problems. So those were communities kind of based around AI tools, so more of like general prompting. But there may be opportunities to kind of better think about the range of what ChatGPT and other AI tools can help with. One of these papers I found recently actually on Archive was trying to figure out all the different ways people are using GPT interfaces. There are core research questions I wanted to call out because one of them is from MSR actually, or Microsoft, was thinking about what are the real world queries, like what are people actually doing in practice to kind of understand, so looking at ShareGPT, what are people asking ChatGPT, what are the tasks and what are the actual functions that they can kind of evolve off of. Oh, I forgot the other question. And then what are the emerging requirements that were not currently captured in any of the tools, in any of the online communities? And also just based off the hands in the room, the adoption of them, right? Some of these tools I've mentioned have been around for a while. But if they're not helpful, Maybe there's something missing. Maybe they're only helpful in specific contexts, specific domains. And that's why I really like this work, where they were really investigating, well, they looked at Hugging Face and looked at Shared GPT. So Shared GPT was the one I showed earlier, where you can save the prompts and share them broadly. And here they were looking at the domains and topics of what people are talking about. Is the cursor showing here? So people on the line can see. Okay, so here you can see, of course, technology is a big part of it. Code generation, of course, so people actually looking up online to see, like, how can you generate this function for me? But outside of that, we're getting into creative writing. You know, we're getting into different expressions here, reading comprehension, information retrieval. So definitely broader opportunities than just writing code. And I think it's really important to think about how can we better support maybe the peripheral task of software development. Maybe there's opportunity to write, beyond documentation. Maybe there's like the brainstorming of ideas, the creative formation of ideas. Because people are doing it, people are actually seeking that information from these agents. How do we better empower that or enable that? Can we do that in a way that kind of supports software development? Essentially, there's so many uncharted territories to kind of investigate. One of them that we're looking at, or was previously looking at, was how we can leverage the expertise of team members within a software organization. So this paper we recently released at MSR, we were really trying to figure out how we can leverage the ideas of communities, the expertise of communities when we can't have that person in the room. Or if they're in a software organization, they're in a different team and they're in different meetings, how do we leverage that expertise to better help us refine metrics for something we're building, or development tasks that are maybe requirements. We need help with requirements, for instance. And we want that person's interdisciplinary voice to kind of leverage or to inform us away. I'm trying to figure out how to carefully talk about this because it can be really scary. Essentially, we're really thinking about context-specific opportunities to leverage expertise and do it in an iterative way internally within companies. We could also do something similar to this, like internally within a department. You know, how do you leverage expertise of other faculty members who aren't here? How do you do that for the broader research community? That's one of our core contexts, actually. So we're trying to figure out how do we better enable communities and the knowledge flow that happens in communities, but still retaining the time of the expert, being able to have the expert still be able to do their deep focus time. But can we take this a step further? I like to think about the best parts of developer communities. I skipped all of that. Yeah, I like to think through the best parts of developer communities, and then how can we expand on those to devise interventions to better support experiences. So one of those things that we really like about developer communities is thinking about the coding support. That being able to get help right when we need it. Go online and figure out how many other people have had similar questions. Another part was being able to connect with new people. I mean, this was a pretty high value opportunity, during the pandemic. People were, isolated, working remotely, distributed, and they were, looking for companions. I mean, I think we all do that. You move to a new city, you look for a new companion, right? You go to a new department, you just started as a PhD student. Developer communities are great for doing that, great at least initiating some of those things. People have online buddies and later on even collaborators. There's also the opportunity to kind of give back. So it's altruism, being able to give back to a community that you've gotten so much from. So maybe as an undergraduate, you all got a lot of insight from like Stack Overflow. But maybe there's like the new community that's popping up on the scene, like Share GPT, for instance, and you want to be able to kind of give that altruism, provide the altruism, or fulfill the altruism, I should say. And then I think the best part, the highlight part that I think a lot of us introverts, or even the extroverted introverts, as sometimes people like to frame me as, is the ability to disengage when you're tired of it. When you're like, okay, if I engaged, I helped out, I supported the novice, I made my new friends, now I'm done with this. I can literally just close my computer and move on. So the ability to disengage in communities as needed. So those are some of the highlights of some of these developer communities. And I wonder if there's ways to kind of like use some of these AI tools to better enable that, to support that. So if folks are already familiar with AI Xcoder, tab 9. I don't know if folks are also familiar with Overflow AI. it's fine if you're not. Again, another organization's tool to kind of help you better refine search of information, help you write better answers, or find the questions that you need to find on Stack Overflow, essentially. But I wonder if there's ways to kind of further be critical and disrupt the way we engage in developer communities. And especially around community membership. So how folks engage in the community based on the challenge we talked about before. So for instance, you can think about if there was an agent to help me find the right place to contribute. If there's an agent to help me find the right place to get better received participation or well-received participation. So if I find the right community that I can answer the best or answer a good amount of questions, can the agent help me navigate that? There could also be an agent help us grow in roles. So moving from an active or not an active contributor, but starting from a lurker to active contributor. Is there a way to kind of have like this empowerment agent to kind of find those opportunities so I can post more, grow in my roles, and be a sustained member of the community? There's a huge sustainability problem in open source, right? If there's a way to kind of like empower and enable the people who are engaging and contributing there, not just the productivity of the work, but them as community members. And that's why I don't think we have a lot of opportunities in. Even finding those sub-communities where they can add the most value. I think a lot of prior research have really highlighted that a lot of people want to contribute, want to help, they want to share, but they don't know where to go. Since we talk a lot about these uses of agents, can they help search and navigate the best place that's bespoke to the work that we can do and that we're best suited to do? So essentially, you can think of these as agents of navigation in a way. I think we're focusing a lot on productivity of the work. I think it's valuable, but I think there's a lot of opportunities to kind of like expand that. And the next couple of slides are really going to be maybe a little bit out there, but hopefully you all can follow and kind of follow along with me when I think about the next AI agents for communities. What if there was a way to kind of stumble upon communities? I mentioned earlier, you've just come to a new city. So say we're at a conference, a research conference, first time going to Copenhagen. And you're walking down the street and you're like, oh, there's a new restaurant. I've never heard of this restaurant before. You stumble upon it and you enter it and you find out that, oh, they're doing pottery classes and I love pottery classes. Or I didn't know I was into pottery classes. What if there's a way that you could be coding as a software developer and you're in the flow, you're grooving, and you're like, well, actually, I want to code in an environment that's going to be more open. Like I want to be around other people who are working, who are also like deep and focused work, but maybe not yet. I don't want them to engage me, right? I don't want them to interrupt my flow. But so you think of this like coffee shops. So for me, I'm a big coffee shop worker. Maybe I'm in a coffee shop and I want to be able to do deep focus work and I want to see other people who are doing deep focus work. Are there other ways other new affordances of communities we should be exploring, considering? Maybe I'm like flowing and this is an example of like being in the flow, being in a community that has new affordances of like, I'm actually coding, there's a visual reminder of what I'm doing. And I engage in another community who's brainstorming based on the different stage of the software development lifecycle that I'm in. Maybe there's new ways we could be thinking about how we support software development work. Maybe we're at the end of the life cycle and we're thinking about, okay, now that I finished this snippet and I'm actually reached a point where I can demo what I'm working on. There's a group of people probably working and figuring out their best way to present this work to stakeholders. So are there ways you can stumble upon online communities in this way? Is there like a setting we can create that can support that? In some ways, the example I showed before of like, okay, I'm working on something, I'm working on a code snippet, Copilot recognizes that, oh, this snippet is similar to what other folks have been sharing online. It may be helpful for you to share or engage if you reached a point that doesn't interrupt your cognitive process. Other ways to better support this flow. Can we rethink how we look at flow, how we look at productivity, how we engage and discover and stumble upon community? I think with the use of some of these new agents, which are really helpful for search, we can figure out how we can search and find those spaces. Just some food for thought. I really want to challenge us to think a little bit more about how we can use what's available at our fingertips. Another one that I think is also really interesting is expanding developer communities beyond our work. Well, I'll talk about work first, actually. What if there was an instance? What if there was an instance of a digital twin, where this is an extension of you, not your direct likeness per se, but maybe a version of you that can be present in meetings when you can't go. Maybe you're deep in work, and maybe the meeting is low stakes. Is there a way we can send an extension of ourselves to have refined answers, or only have discrete answers of what to say in a meeting to reflect your perspective, so your presence is felt although you can't be there? So this is very scoped I'm talking about. There's a way to kind of bend the way we work, the way we spend our time. We've been able to use virtual meetings to kind of bend space, right? To be able to kind of be, although we're not physically in the same room, or with our collaborators, we can meet with them on video conferencing. Can we extend ourselves in that way? Are there tasks that may be better suited for? So maybe if I'm an expert developer and I'm working with a novice and I have deep focus work I need to work through, can I send my agent who's already been on my shoulder, record, or essentially looking at my GitHub Copilot screen and seeing what I'm working on? Can we record that instance and share that with the novice? Can we extend ourselves? Are there certain tasks or certain development tasks that enable that, or are better suited for that? I mean, going further, are there ways we should be thinking about trusting these agents? Are they going to be, how can we trust that they're a good reflection of us? Are there boundaries, guidelines we should be setting up? I should also highlight that this isn't total speculation. The Zoom CEO has talked a lot about digital twins. I'm sure I'll send slides, the links and stuff though, if folks are interested, but these are all screenshots from articles. I did not generate these, these are real. Real images, people speculating what this could look like because they are in progress. So how do we better enable those tools to support our offline or online communities? I mentioned a little bit about guidelines. You know, I'm guilty. I work at a big organization. Should big organizations be the ones setting these guidelines? Should it be a collaborative effort? Should we be the main key stakeholders there? Should it be engaging with populations who maybe use this technology or would benefit from this technology the most? So people who are like distributed across continents, people who don't have the physical ability to be in the room, the physical ability to travel to places. How do we include those in the conversation, those people in the conversation? I mentioned a little, I think I said I was going to talk about agents for beyond work, but maybe there's also agents for play, joy. Maybe there's opportunities to use an agent kind of to reflect or as a reflection tool for us. Something I was working on previously with some actual students at CMU was figuring out how Black software developers were building tools for Black people experiences, essentially. If you know me, I do a lot of work with like sub-communities, learning a lot from marginalized communities and figuring out how we can expand that for the broader context. One of those things that came out of that study, which is really interesting, is how people were designing for a certain, like intentionally designing for different experiences, where folks were designing for survival, for culture. But what was really interesting, and we don't talk enough about, is designing for joy and celebration. Like rightfully so, we are skeptical of many of the new technologies coming out, maybe less so in this room, but most times when I talk to people, they're like, how do we protect people? We should protect people. Yes, we should protect people. But we should also be thinking about how we can, celebrate, expand our minds to be thinking about joyous occasions. And what if we had agents that can really help us reflect on that joy? So I've talked to several researchers, and it's come out in a study for people who are end users and using some of these like tools like ChatGPT. But people are using these agents, okay, ChatGPT, Claude, and others, as a way to kind of figure out their own challenges, their mental health challenges, their wellness, figuring out how to find joy in those situations. What if we could use agents intentionally for that? Because people are using that way already. Are there ways to kind of do it in a way that, especially in times of strife when there are severe challenges, there's ongoing research kind of happening now to figure out how to best support that, especially during like specialized work. And also, should we be doing that when it's based on specialized work, actually? Other ways to kind of, first of all, we think about how we can find joy in the everyday tasks, mundane tasks we're doing. But should we use agents to really help us understand our specialized tasks and find the joy in them? Because the specialized tasks mean that you're getting a lot of knowledge from if it's proprietary, if you work at a software organization, you may not want the data collection, right? I mentioned a lot about the concerns about privacy and conspiracy, or I don't want to say conspiracy, but the privacy concerns, and that data being shared. Maybe there's an agent we can use. A ditto should be our reflection tool, our diary, if you will, because that is how some people are using some of these tools as their diary to kind of reflect on what challenges have been happening and where they can find value. I want us to kind of really think about how we can empower joy. We can be skeptical, and rightfully so, but I think there's a lot of opportunity in figuring out what brings happiness. And these agents can be really helpful at that. So as I'm closing, a quick recap. I talked a little bit about how we can the TikTok for developer communities and what that could look like, how the community affordances, our ability to vote, our ability to share, our ability to kind of give feedback can be really helpful for us building our own trust, and how we influence others to build a similar trust model. Likewise, I highlighted some of the previous ways or opportunities that we can use agents to better empower our membership in communities and encouraging others to be members or active members in communities. There's ongoing research happening now that are expanding beyond code generation tools. How can we leverage that to figure out how we can support better creative tasks, creative work beyond software development, or the creative work that is aligned with software development? And I hope I didn't scare you all too much about the future of some of the ways we engage in communities. But I think we should really be thinking about how we can really use agents as enablers in offline and online settings. So with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for some questions.
Thanks for the talk. Great talk. Really interesting. One thing I wanted to ask about with respect to the digital twins, standing in for you at meetings and that sort of thing. There's so much concern these days, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of it too, about people being replaced, and this is happening in Hollywood, potentially in many other places. Are there particular ways that you might think about designing the digital twin, or creating context for its use, or other ways of kind of preventing that from happening, but maybe more importantly, keeping people from fearing that that's kind of what's going to go on?
I think that's a great question, Jim. And I think that goes back to the broader point I was kind of mentioning of like who should be the holder of these guidelines. But maybe this is the opportunity to kind of do it in a collective way where we have the input of so many folks, even outside of the folks who make the technology. So outside of organizations like Microsoft. So if we're gathering perspectives from people who've been speculating about some of these tools before. So one of the big scary use cases, to be very concrete, is people are worried about digital twins replacing people who have passed on, right? Who do we engage in that conversation? Can we set those preemptive guidelines now? Because those tools are in the works. I mentioned Zoom is looking at that. These tools are in the works. Can we start the starting point for some of these guidelines, have them be iterative? Maybe they're owned by organization, maybe they're owned by a policy organization. Maybe they're owned by, you mentioned film, maybe they're owned by like an academy, or maybe they're a stakeholder in the conversation. And I think it's important to think about all these things before these tools became widestream, because right now I feel like so many of us are thinking about retroactively what to do with tools like GitHub Copilot. And if we can set the guidelines now, we can set the stage early on. So I think it's about getting the right people in the room, and what's the forum for that? TBD, I guess.
I really like the concentration on trust in these communities, and I'm kind of concerned about what happens in the future where the AIs have ulterior motives that we don't understand. So if you think about all the work that you're talking about, but from an adversarial standpoint, of the AIs have this motive to try to get you to believe in something, to get you to trust them, but they're telling you something false. Is there a way to protect yourself from the introduction of, or the rise of the AI in all these community spaces where theoretically you were having friends with other real people, and now there could be an AI trying to fake being your friend so that they can get you to buy something or get you to do something yourself even.
Yeah, that's a very realistic, I mean, that's a valid concern. I think it goes back to a guidelines perspective too. If we can set up preventative cases from now. I don't really have the solution for this, but I think this is a valid concern of when we're hypothesizing about digital twins and what it will look like. What are those boundaries we're not gonna cross? Like, and how do we enforce that is the real question. How do you sanction when people do cross those boundaries? And how do you verify when it has happened?
If you lose trust,
Yeah.
is there a way to regain it?
Yeah. How are we rebuilding that trust, essentially? Yeah, I think that's a great question, actually. Yeah, I don't have the answer for that one. Oh, yes.
Thank you for an overview of a lot of things, many of which were new to me in community building. A thing that I am missing is the connection to ground truth. So there are software systems out there that actually have to be objectively correct.
Yes.
And consensus is not the same thing as correctness. And when I say correctness, I actually have a pretty nuanced view of correctness. It's not just what you get out of program verification, which is only showing that the code matches the spec. But it cannot be whether it matches a specification, because we often don't have a specification. We're often building in an exploratory form to find something that seems to solve our needs. Can you say anything about how you move from these kinds of interactions to knowing how much you should trust the tools, and to knowing whether the thing that you have created is sufficiently correct or trustworthy or appropriate for the use for which you intended?
That's a great question. I first of all, I want to call out this point of like correctness is not consensus. That feels like a quote that should be highlighted.
I just made it up.
It's great. I'll attribute this to you for sure.
We all know that correlation is not causality. And
Exactly.
This is like correlation is not causality.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think this is like a concern sometimes people have about communities. It's like people talk to themselves, agents are talking to themselves, and they're essentially like, okay, well we have to collectively come to a decision, but if that decision is not the ground truth, then was it even worth the value? Was it even worth doing?
But also there are examples of code snippets that have erroneous code snippets that have been propagated and copied and copied and copied. And tiny code snippets where you can find the error and say, yes, this is an error and it has been promulgated. How do you make the bridge from community building and community advising to, say, responsibility for actually documenting the stuff that we're passing out, to providing tests against ground truth, to helping people get past the all my friends believe this, to should we really trust it, and how much do we need to trust it in order to make progress?
I think accountability is a big part of it. I was talking to Jim about this earlier, actually, of like who is accountable for resharing. Also, who are the leaders who can put the stake in the ground and say, this is incorrect, and how do you believe that as a valid voice? So when you think about that in communities, if I'm thinking about there's a consensus and people are resharing things that are incorrect, if one person goes in there and says, actually, this is wrong, and they're gonna be like, why should I believe you? Evidence. How do we create platforms that allow us to kind of have that supporting evidence and confirm that this is not up for debate, confirm that's what's not up for debate?
Well, that's evidence of error. What about evidence of adequacy?
Of adequacy.
So you described, I have evidence that there is an error here. And
Yes.
here is the error, look at it, you can trust me. But evidence of adequacy, of sufficient correctness is a harder thing to show.
It is a hard thing to show. It is a harder thing to show. I don't know why I'm going back to like a combination of this consensus and that evidence. So that's like one person, but it's like a consensus of multiple sources of evidence. The same way if someone shows you something or tells you something that you know is not true, and you find the source and then say that's not enough. You have to find multiple sometimes it's helpful, it drives home the points to have multiple examples, multiple templates of what is the truth. And I feel like that is also something we do in research as well. So I feel like that would be actually a great value added to do that, integrate that into communities as well. That's a great perspective, actually. Yeah, we need to chat.
Thank you for the talk. In your work, I'm seeing a spectrum of kind of sources of knowledge or representation of knowledge between where the AI is placed. So you have on one side the digital twins, some of the sources like individual knowledge, but then you also have AI in communities like the representation of community knowledge. I'm wondering if you see along this spectrum how the use case of AI changes, or maybe even how something like ways of encouraging or enabling trust changes between the two sides of the spectrum.
Trust changes from the collective knowledge or in an individual knowledge as well in communities. Yeah, that's a great question. I think overall, what's influenced, it kind of leads me back to my answer I was giving her earlier, was the multiple sources of evidence. Like when you think of online communities, when I think of online communities, I think what makes them really helpful, even when I find like an answer that seems believable, has been verified, I think is not just this one example of one individual's perspective and their responses and what they decided to accept an answer. But I think what drives it home for me is having multiple sources and the collection of the curated amount of sources. So I think at the point, one of the points I was trying to make as well is that communities can be really helpful for highlighting those individual perspectives that are validated, or also ones that are not as highly recognized or reputable. But being able to also have the collective decision making, being able to have the discussion, like that's the key part of it too. So I'm not sure if I answered your question actually, but I kind of went on my own mental tangent there.
I don't know, I think you did.
Yeah, I think of it as the spectrum. I think it is going to continue to evolve, but I think it bounces back and forth depending on what you're looking for, right? So I think it bounces back and forth depending on if you're a person who looks for multiple sources, or if you just need a verified answer. Okay.
So I really like these affordances, like this share snippet, and like the yet some others, like 50% of other people did it this way type of things. But I want those in like all my tools, right? So like I use a lot of end user programming tools, and they're talking about these developers plus, where it's like in the LabVIEW forums or Power Apps or Excel forums even, the way to get help is you take a screenshot of what you're looking at, and then you have to wait like a day for someone to respond and tell you, actually, we need to see some other information. So is there any way to like take these affordances and scale them to this long tail of tools and communities where it's not just text code? But you can't go implement all these these features into all the tools, right? So like, is there any way to scale it?
I mean, I think that's a great question. I think that's why some communities like, I think it was called Discourse, where you're able to kind of have these platforms people can build up, and people are being able to adopt some of the community principles from them. So I don't know if it's Discourse, it was another version of another developer community, it was like all that in. Essentially, there were affordances you can take and build your own community, where you can have discussion forums, you can have the voting mechanism. But the part that you mentioned about the screenshot, and that's a different, like, that's
so annoying.
Yeah, that is annoying, and also to be able to follow up on it. So I'm even thinking about in internal communities as well. So for instance, if we're doing something with verification of our IDs now, or of our accounts, there was an issue with it. I had to take a screenshot, send it to the team, wait an extended period of time, when really the solution would have been better if I could find the forum where others have shared their experiences and how they resolved it. But essentially the way that the format we were using was not as helpful for that. Teams was not as helpful for being able to kind of have that type of sub-community engagement in a rich way. I think there could be opportunities for bigger platforms, for this kind of to be like a platform you can build out and have and like pull in different affordances that are helpful. So like the screen recording, for instance.
Yeah.
Well, I think that part stood out a lot to our participants, which was being able to say, how can I automatically start that recording? How can I automatically share, but also how can I then have information redacted? Because this is
Right, exactly.
that's probably that's also a very big challenge, which we had a lot of hesitation on as well. And I think there's an opportunity to kind of build the new set of community baseline like platform beyond voting, beyond the discussion, redacting screen sharing, and maybe there's a way to do that with the technology we have now. And that's my biggest gripe about everything. It's like, can we really do things to enable community membership, community participation, beyond just helping them search for information, refine how they're going to find the next question so they can figure out the next answer.
Sounds like a good startup.
Yeah, let me know if you started. I mean, like I said, this is something I was pushing a while ago, and at the time there wasn't as much bite on it, honestly. But there's definitely the need for it, which is why smaller sub-communities keep popping up. And it may be the next opportunity for my next intern to come work with me, and we can build this out. And we can test it out at scale, because it was actually really exciting to see the interest. It's just the fact that it doesn't exist at scale yet. Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation, very interesting. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on some of the challenges that you're noticing with regards to the concept of collective sense-making with communities, especially in contexts where writing code can be really situated and dependent on the technical problems that collaborative coding teams with. So for example, if I'm a coder and I'm working writing a piece of code, but in the context of a technical problem, I'm contributing my code to code base, how will I be able to make sense, collectively make sense of that code with other people who might not be part of that context?
No, that's a great question. And I think that's why this is helpful for specific teams, like products. So I'm working at Microsoft, a big product is VS Code, right? So being able to have it centered around a product, and then there's also cross-functional teams, for instance. How are you able to kind of allow it to make, there's an additional factor of understanding the code base itself and being able to find that as a sub-community, being able to contribute to that forum for that as a sub-community, essentially. So finding ways that are aligned with your skills, what you're working on, the way you work, the programming language you use, the product you support, your requirements, that is a factor in understanding how to do that intentionally, at least within organizations. And that was kind of our goal of how do we do these things within organizations, but what does it look like to scale broadly for open communities? Like for open communities, you can look across tags, right? You can look across programming languages. It doesn't quite you can do that, like there's different versions of that internally, but it's not as meaningful contributions, right? You're still not able to kind of find the deep opportunities there. So I think when we think about internal organizations, thinking about it in terms of product, roles, is really about your internal community. So if you're in a product team, if you're in VS Code, you probably know the other PMs. You know what the neighboring team next door is working on, right? So being able to, from there, you already have those offline relationships in that context. And that way you're able to more meaningfully contribute to the collective sense-making around a particular product. And then those who transition into your team, if you go to another role, they'll be able to kind of build on that knowledge. So I think honestly that what I'm presenting here is, it makes the most effective, it has the most impact internally with the organizations. That's a great point. Thank you.
Today, thank you for the great talk. So I guess my question is kind of along, as you're thinking about the opportunities for various things, like you kind of showcased the last few slides here, but also kind of thinking about the opportunity for one of the advantages of agents being that there's maybe a potential for personalization, but also kind of thinking and considering how maybe different developers might have different priorities when it comes to how their satisfaction with using an agent is kind of modeled. Kind of on the evaluation side, if you thought about ways to kind of capture the extent to which different agents that have the same goal, how those different goals are modeled when developers might have different needs or different visions of this agent working successfully. This is more on the research side.
Yeah, in different versions and definitions of success.
Definitions of success, or even just different mental models of success.
Yeah. This makes me think about like how you surface that. Like what are transient, like lightweight ways to kind of surface that information? For some of the speculative work I've been thinking about for digital twins, for instance, is like how do you kind of highlight that information that is already the context? How do you highlight that context that's already there? For a different study, we were looking at some of the affordances of like early GitHub Copilot. And one of those big challenges that we found out, and this paper was at FACT recently, was trying to figure out how do you set the context, how do you clarify the context of what you want the suggestion to kind of be considering, not just all the functions in the file, but maybe the specific ones that make the most sense. What does that look like in other settings outside of the IDE? Like, so for me right now, I'm thinking about if I'm having a meeting with someone, how do I set the context of what all the knowledge that is important to this specific meeting? As in like, people set out meeting agendas before a meeting. You all had the abstract before this talk. You had a context for what I was gonna talk about. How do you kind of share that in a different way? In a way that's kind of, that matches the two difference, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Any other questions?
All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.